presentation is on dangerous plants in pastures and paddocks, and I am presenting today. My name is Hayley White. I am the Small Farms Outreach Coordinator with OSU Extension Small Farms in Marion and Polk County, and with the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District. So a bit of a long title, but I help small farmers, including equine farms and farmers with all kinds of small farm resources, programming, technical advice, etc. So for today, what we'll be talking about is dangerous plants that you might have in your pastures and paddocks, what leads to these weeds, when do poisonings happen, some weed identification of common weeds in the area, timing, and then some resources to share, and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you have something pressing like technical difficulties, trouble with the polls, anything like that, you can type it in the chat and Melissa Ferry will kind of help us out here. But any big questions we'll save to the end, if you don't mind. All right, we will be having a few polls tonight. I know not everyone likes to use polls, so they're not required. They are anonymous. Questions will automatically pop up on your screen. You can select your answers. Again, if you have any trouble, let us know. And no pressure if you're not interested in participating in polls. I will not be offended. All right, to start us off, we have some easy questions here. Which best describes you? There'll be a few options for you on your screen in just a second here. And then the other question is, do you have dangerous plants in your pastures? Give you a minute or so to get those answers in. It should just pop up on your screen if you want to select your answer. Okay, I think we have most everybody has participated. A lot of equine owners, a few equine center, boarding managers, and then a few none of these. So that's interesting. Welcome, everyone. So some answers to do you have poisonous plants in your pastures? We have some definitely, some I think so. I'm not sure, that's why I'm here, duh, of course. And then no or not applicable. Thank you for that. All right, let's get started here. All right, so the best place to start this conversation off is at the source. What leads to weeds? And this includes dangerous weeds in your pasture. Poor pasture management is the root cause of a serious weed problem. And I say serious because there will always be a weed or two. Even perfect pasture managers still have to manage weeds. It's always a component of having livestock on grazing lands. But today, when we're talking about dangerous plants, when you're really going to have a problem is when your pastures have been overgrazed, have compaction issues, and when weeds haven't been managed properly. And this could be things like timing or just improper management. Dr. Shayan Gajar talked about pasture management in the first class, so I won't go into too much detail. When you overgraze, it slows and even prevents plant growth, and that reduces the productivity of forage in your pasture, and weeds will grow in its place. Compaction happens when you have animals out on wet, vulnerable pastures, when the ground is soft, and this creates mud, bare ground, and plenty of open real estate for weeds to move in. I know we hammer this a lot in extension, but we can't say it enough. Keep your animals off wet pastures when they're vulnerable. Use heavy use areas, sacrifice areas. Melissa Ferry talked about this in the previous presentation. Your horses and your pastures will thank you. All right, and when do poisonings happen? They happen often when there isn't enough forage in the pasture. So say you don't have productive forage, and really the only thing green and growing out in your pasture is a lot of weeds, or you just have a high percentage of weeds in general. You have hungry horses who don't have anything else to eat. Some horses just are goofballs and will eat some poisonous or injurious weeds. A lot, it could be young horses, sometimes it's geldings. You just have that that horse every once in a while that just wants to eat weird stuff. Ways you can minimize the risk and lower the chances of having your animals be poisoned is to feed before going to pasture. This is something that was talked about in previous presentations. It's just kind of an important rule in general. If you have low forage production and a lot of weeds, supplement their diet. It also helps to be familiar with poisonous weeds. So part of that is attending presentations like these, learning to identify some of the heavy hitters, getting familiar with them. So when you see them in your pastures, you can start some management. And then also just to be out in your pastures regularly, walk your pastures, know what's out there, see your animals, see your horses, of course, manage it, be aware of any signs and symptoms that seem abnormal. Being out there and seeing what's growing in your pasture and looking at your animals is a really great way to minimize risk. There are a ton of different signs and symptoms of toxicity in horses. These are just a few. I'll mention some others in this presentation, but they might include difficulty swallowing or breathing, colic, laminitis, incoordination, photosensitization, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, and many more. First things first, if you ever think your horse has been poisoned or is showing signs, call your veterinarian immediately. So we'll go into IDing some common poisonous plants that are in pastures in the Willamette Valley and other areas of Oregon. Our main categories are forbs, trees and shrubs, grasses, and injurious plants. So with forbs, it's our first section. A forb is it's a broadleaf plant that flowers and isn't grass, which kind of helps to narrow it down a little bit. But a lot of weedy species are forbs. Not all forbs are weeds. Also includes a lot of flowers, a lot of native plants that can be beneficial. Just to give you a little background if you hadn't heard that term before. So we're going to start with tansy ragwort. It's a big one in this area. I get a lot of calls. Often I get calls late in the summer, which isn't the best time for management, which we'll go into. But for identification, tansy ragwort has, especially in early stages, has dark green ruffled leaves, can be 2 to 4 feet tall when mature. And when it flowers, it has clusters of little yellow daisy-like flowers. Tansy ragwort contains toxic alkaloids, which primarily affect the liver. Cells of the liver are slowly killed or prevented from reproducing and gradually get replaced by connective tissue. Symptoms might not show up until months later, and it can be hard to diagnose. Another thing to remember with tansy ragwort is that it remains toxic even when dried, which is common with a lot of these poisonous plants that we'll talk about. But why that's so important is if you go out to manage it, say you dig it up, you only have a few small clusters in your pasture, you dig it up, toss it over your shoulder, leave it out in your pasture, that plant is going to dry up and it will lose some of those characteristics that tell the animal that it's toxic. So in general, animals will usually, except for those few exceptions, will avoid eating toxic plants as long as there is plenty of forage available for them to eat. But when you leave a dried tansy ragwort or other weeds out there, dries up, you can also have toxicities from that happening as well. The best time to control tansy is in the spring. So right now, it's going to be a common thing I mentioned throughout the presentation. Spring is a great time to manage and be the most effective. If you have small infestations of tansy, you can dig it up when the ground is moist. Be sure to get all of the taproot. You can also apply broadleaf herbicides that are labeled for tansy ragwort. It's most effective during the rosette stage of the plant before it's really bolted and goes to seed. And again, as with any herbicide I mentioned in this presentation, make sure to follow the label exactly. If you have any questions at all, you can talk to your local extension office or your soil and water conservation district, and they can advise you. With tansy ragwort, mowing usually is not recommended. It can actually increase growth, and that's with a few of these plants. Depends on the growth type of the plant, but in general, it's not recommended for tansy ragwort. All right, next up, I was just telling Melissa that I have had probably in the last 2 weeks, 6 calls on poison hemlock. It's extremely toxic and can cause terrible skin irritation and lesions on humans. So do not touch it. Wear protective gear, gloves, long sleeves if you're going to try and manage it. This plant can easily be confused with several lookalikes. So it's really important to identify it correctly. Also, don't just go off of one characteristic that you've heard and say, oh, it's definitely not, or it's definitely it. It's better if you kind of combine these, and I'll go over them. But at any point, if you're not sure, you can always send really good pictures or safely bring in a sample to your local extension office or SWCD. So some ways to identify it. It has leaves that are similar to plants in like the carrot and parsley family. They're kind of fern-like. And these leaves on poison hemlock can actually smell musty, and some say like mouse urine, but if you're not familiar with mouse urine, it just doesn't smell great when you crush the leaves if you do it with gloves on. But don't go solely off of smell. The leaves and stems will be hairless. So that's another strong characteristic to look for. And the stem will have these purple splotches, which you can kind of see right here. And I know it's confusing. Splotches isn't exactly a real technical term, but you can kind of tell the difference between, say, streaking or striping. It kind of looks like paint splatter. It's splotchy. That helps to identify it. That splotching is pretty distinctive. The stem will be hollow, but again, don't just go off of a hollow stem. There are similar plant species like chervil. They will also have hollow stems, so it's important, again, to look at multiple characteristics. But if it has a combination of hairless leaves and stem, hollow stem, purple splotches, and a musty smell when the leaves are crushed, it's most likely poison hemlock. Again, animals generally leave this plant alone unless there is no other forage available. Signs of poisoning usually appear within an hour after the animal eats this plant. This one's extremely highly toxic. And animals can die from respiratory paralysis depending on how much they ate in the animal in 2 to 3 hours even. Similar to tansy ragwort, for small patches, you can dig them up as long as you have protective gear on. Again, very toxic to humans as well. Some tilling can be successful in certain areas, and then herbicides can be used on seedlings or small plants in the rosette stage. Using herbicide on fully mature plants that have flowered, it's not going to be super successful. So that's why timing is really, really important. Timing like right now in this late spring, early summer period is a great time to start managing these weeds. Here's just a few more pictures for you. Again, here's more example of those purple splotches. You can see what the flower looks like, these white flowers that come up from the top, and these carrot-like, fern-like, I think of them as kind of lacy. They're kind of delicate leaves. All right, next up we have water hemlock, frequently called the most toxic plant in the Pacific Northwest. This plant grows often along waterways like ditches, canals, streams, and it only takes a piece of a root the size of a walnut to kill a horse. So very important, not one you're really going to see too often in pasture situations, but if you have a waterway and happen to see it, it's a good one to know. This one is also very toxic to humans. Wear protective gear, and be really careful when working on it in waterways, because if you expose that root or damage the plant and it gets in the water can be toxic and harmful as well. So with these ones, it's really a good idea to call your local SWCD or extension office for management. This one's really big. An identifying characteristic is its bulbous roots, which you can see a section of here that are mostly hollow. And these can get pretty big, about 2 to 8 feet tall. Next up, we have bracken fern. Bracken fern has broad triangular leaves, and they're usually kind of in a group of 3. The plant reaches a height of about 2 to 4 feet. And unlike other species, it grows directly from stout black horizontal roots instead of growing from like a center point. Bracken fern contains thiaminase. A lot of these words are a mouthful, but it's an inhibitor that leads to the development of thiamine deficiency in horses. And this luckily can be remedied by giving thiamine, but again, not one that you want to have a lot of in your pastures. It can also be carcinogenic to people or just in general, so one you want to avoid. And the poison in bracken fern has a cumulative effect. So livestock are affected only after they've eaten a considerable amount for over a period of time. So it's not going to happen right away like some others. It's a cumulative toxin. These can be controlled in areas by using like cultivation or tilling. Plants can be managed by tilling the soil for 2 to 3 years, is what some studies have shown. But there are also, again, herbicides that can be used on bracken fern, depending on your preference there. All right, real quickly, I have a short video. If you're like me and newer to Western Oregon, you don't see ferns too often in Eastern Oregon. So for me, it's always good to really see some fern examples here. And this is a short video on how to identify them.
Oh wow, look at all these bracken ferns, gorgeous. Now bracken ferns are a really cool, really unique, fairly tall, upright fern growing up to 2 meters tall with very triangular shaped fronds. Now these fronds often have multiple branchings of very lance-shaped leaflets for a total of 2 to 3 pinnate. Now pinnate's a technical term that's used to classify the branchings of leaves. So from this main stem, this would be the first, this would be the second, and then those would be the third pinnate on which there are these tiny little leaves that house the sori underneath them. Bracken ferns are often commonly confused with lady ferns or spiny wood ferns, with the main difference being that both of those ferns are monopods, meaning they have a central rhizome from which all the fronds sprout from a central cluster. Bracken ferns, on the other hand, are known as polypods, meaning that each frond sprouts individually from an underground rhizome network, sort of like this guy here. Now bracken ferns
All right, so I hope you can hear that video okay. I just like to have some other visual examples, especially if I'm unfamiliar with the plant, so I hope that was helpful. Real quick, we have our next poll that will launch soon, but the question is, which of these weeds, A or B, is poison hemlock? Now, depending on the size of your screen, you might not be able to see all the details, but let's say if I'm looking at plant A, I might be able to tell that there are some fine hairs on the leaves in the close-up picture. It does have some purple on the stem in A. B, some defining characteristics are the leaves seem to be hairless, and you also see purple, but maybe in a different pattern. It's kind of a tough one. All right, I think we have most of the responses in. If you want to launch or share the results. Yes, most of you got this right, plant B. And I know this is difficult, and I'm sharing this because these are the plant A is an example of pictures I took. It can be really confusing. You see purple, you see those leaves, and you think, oh, it's poison hemlock, or vice versa. Maybe you think, oh, it's not poison hemlock. But plant A is most likely a chervil or chevril. It has more streaking or striping on that stem versus splotching. It has hairs all over the leaves on the tops and backside of them. The stem was pretty much hairless in number A, so it wouldn't have been good just to go off of a hairless stem for A. But number B is correct. It is poison hemlock. You've got splotching, you've got hairless leaves. If you cut it open, it's going to be hollow, and most likely if you crush those leaves, it's not going to smell great. So thank you for participating here. And while I have you, I have one more poll in this section. If you could tell me what this plant is. The poll should be up on your screen now. I want to take a moment. Wait for one or two more. Okay, we'll go ahead and share these results. This one was a bit of a trick question. I was trying to trip you up just a little bit. We just talked about ferns. This is a fern, but this is, I believe, a sword fern. So why we know it's not a bracken fern is it's growing from a central point instead of individuals from a rhizomatous root. And then also, bracken ferns have those groups of 3 triangular leaves, and this one has really long, singular, tall leaves. So I put that in there to stump a few people. Okay, next up we have yellow star thistle. Yellow star thistle isn't as common in the Willamette Valley. It is found in other areas of Oregon. And it's important to know because sometimes it can be found dried in hay. And as I mentioned before, even dried poisonous plants can be, they stay toxic, and it's easier for animals to eat them. This weed grows up to 12 inches tall. Leaves are covered with a cottony kind of hair, and the yellow flowers have these 1-inch, very stiff little spikes at the base of them. This one is also a cumulative toxin, and it can take over 30 to 60 days before it shows symptoms of them, ingesting it. And signs of this one includes dysfunction of facial, mouth, and throat muscles, depression, and even dehydration are some of the early signs. Again, not as common, but it's important to be familiar with your hay source. And if you're feeding hay and notice anything that looks similar, it'd be good to ID. All right, next up is larkspur. This one, again, isn't as common, but just good to know, good to be aware of. There are a few different varieties. Luckily, larkspur, even different varieties, pretty distinctive depending on the variety. They grow to be about 1 to 6 feet tall. They have hollow stems, and usually they have kind of this blue and purplish flowers, as you can see, kind of in like a conical shape. And reports say that occasionally horses can show clinical effects if they exercise suddenly after eating large quantities of larkspur. So if you have 1 or 2 in your pasture and plenty of forages, nothing to get too alarmed about, but one you want to know and monitor. This one contains multiple alkaloids with varying toxicity. Next up is lupin. Again, similar to larkspur, larkspur and lupin are one that you might recognize on the trail if you enjoy hiking. There's some really pretty native varieties. Not as often in pastures, but they definitely can be. They have these distinctive leaves that kind of come out from a central point in like a semicircle. They usually have bluish purple flowers, but they can really come in any color depending on the variety. Again, if you have plenty of forage and see 1 or 2, it's not a big deal. But if you have a big patch and your forage isn't as productive as you like, it's a good one to manage. These ones, I'll talk about resources later on, but they're, you can dig them up or use herbicide to spot spray. And I'll share with you resources on where to find herbicides if that's the method you like. Next up is St. John's wort. Also known as Klamath weed. This one causes photosensitization. Now, some poisonous plants cause photosensitization, which is when it makes the animal's skin super sensitive to sunlight. So animals that eat St. John's wort and then are exposed to direct sunlight can develop severe burns and irritation on white areas of their body. A lot of the times it's around the nose and mouth, on their face, but really it can be anywhere that they have white hair and it's exposed to the sun. The leaves are covered with clear small dots that actually contain the toxic substances, and the flowers are 5-petaled and grow in clusters. At first signs, if you see any of your animals having problems with photosensitization, you're seeing some burns on the white or light areas of the body, move them out of the sunlight as soon as you can and immediately consult with a vet. These can be controlled by digging or pulling, in the spring when the ground is soft and the plants are smaller, or with properly labeled herbicide. Next up is false dandelion or cat's ear dandelion, and this one's unique or interesting to me, it might contribute to string halt. Now, string halt is a neurological condition that causes mobility issues in the horse's hind legs, and it often happens to horses on pasture, and it's called pasture string halt. The causes of these aren't fully understood, but a large portion of the cases have had similar characteristics. Those characteristics are that horses were diagnosed in late summer when it was hot and dry, limited forage available or on overgrazed pastures or in dry lots, and there was a high population of false dandelion in those areas. So there hasn't been research done yet. Nobody has fed false dandelion to animals and collected data, but it's enough that I definitely wouldn't want to put my horses out until I had it managed. If I didn't have adequate forage available, wasn't following best management practices, it's one you want to know and be aware of and manage. It can be confused with common dandelion. In the picture on the left, you can kind of see the base looks really similar to what we might see with common dandelion in a lot of pastures, but there are some physical differences. Instead of a hollow stem like most dandelions are, with one flower on each stem, false dandelion has a fibrous stem, and the stem branches with multiple flowers on each stem. A false dandelion is a perennial. It makes it, it's challenging to control. It's best to use multiple management strategies. And really that's with a lot of weeds, it's important to use multiple if you can. But this one in particular, soil cultivation, digging, and herbicides together can be effective. Timing is crucial. Applying herbicide during that rosette stage in the spring or in the fall is kind of the best thing to do.
Hayley, I have a bit of a follow-up for that.
Yes, please share.
So there was some effort by researchers to do some study to see if they could create an environment where horses would become sick because of eating it. And that's part of the complexity with this false dandelion or flatweed, whatever you want to call it, and string halt, because in the research trials, they weren't able to induce horses with string halt by eating a large amount of false dandelion. So that's why there's some, we usually see it late in the summer, so it's hot and dry. We don't know if that plays into effect in this whole situation. So it's really a mystery, a little unknown, but like you already mentioned, late summer, lots of false dandelion, not a lot of other forage. So that's why we encourage people to try to manage this one if they can.
Thank you, Melissa. Melissa has an excellent fact sheet about false dandelion and string halt that I will share in the follow-up email. So yeah, thank you for sharing. One you want to keep an eye on. Another yellow, flower that you might see in the area is buttercup. And there are several buttercup species. Many are toxic. They have this distinctive yellow flowers that are very rounded and have 5 petals on each flower. They flower earlier in the year compared to other yellow plants like tansy. And there's different varieties, so they can be different heights. Some are creeping, some are a little bit more upright. Signs of poisoning include irritated mouth membranes, frothing, diarrhea, and abdominal distress. For control with buttercup, again, it can be pulled and dug up when the ground is soft, but depending on the variety, it can be pretty difficult. Repeated cultivation can help, but be careful because seeds of buttercup can last in the soil for up to 20 years. It's really not recommended to mow buttercup, but broadleaf herbicides can be effective in certain situations. All right, this one's a little bit different, like horsetail and scouring rush. Again, you're not likely to see it too often in this area, or it grows in really wet soils, but you might see it dried and in hay. And you might have it on your place. It's just not one that's going to be really, really common. It's good to be familiar with it. It has these segmented stems, a lot like a rush that grows in wet areas. toxic even when dry. This one causes that thiamine deficiency, similar to other ones we've discussed, like bracken fern. And symptoms with ingesting this one include weight loss, diarrhea, weakness, and even mobility and death. So a lot of these have a lot of similar symptoms. I feel like I have to repeat a lot of the same things, but I hope this helps. And again, it's important to know what's out in your pasture so you have some clues if you ever see signs or symptoms. Next up is death camas. Again, this one has multiple species that kind of fall under the death camas name, and they are very poisonous to livestock. It's a perennial that produces grass-like leaves in groups of 3. You can kind of see here in this picture, 3 here, 3 here. They're pretty distinctive. We have a common camas in the area, which is beautiful. It's a really important plant. That one is not poisonous. A distinctive characteristic with them is with death camas, the flower petals are more pointy, like a V shape. I don't have a super close-up picture here, but they're much pointier, spiky compared to more of a lobed leaf in the common camas. You also can't identify them solely on color, because there are some common camases that are a lighter, paler color that almost look white. So the best thing to do is wait until they flower, look at the leaves, work to identify it, and then dig up those bulbs. All right. Now we've finished our Forbes section. Thanks for sticking with me here. And we have our next poll. What is this plant? Don't mind answering that on your screen for me. All right, I think we have most of our answers in. This was a tough one, and I didn't give you the base of the leaves here, but it's false ear dandelion, cat's ear dandelion. You can see that stem branches off. It has multiple flowers, so we know it's not common dandelion. You could also try to cut that stem to see if it's more of a fibrous, not hollow stem compared to common dandelion. So really good job. Thanks for participating. All right, next up we have grasses. This is a short section here. Mainly want to talk about endophytes. So if you aren't familiar, an endophyte is a fungus that lives within a plant, and that fungus grows between the plant cells and into the developing seed. Some endophytes are toxic, some aren't, and you can't tell just by looking at it or taking your sample into your extension office or SWCD. It takes a lab analysis, which I will give you resources on. Many turf varieties and some forage varieties of grasses like tall fescue and perennial ryegrass have endophytes. And endophytes are mostly the biggest problem for breeding mares, who are the most sensitive to endophytes. Endophytes can cause reproductive problems, birth defects. It's really important to know if your grass species have the toxic endophytes or the novel or non-toxic endophytes, or if they're endophyte free. If you're familiar with what's in your pasture, or if you've used pasture-specific seeds mixes recently, it's most likely that you have the new and improved or endophyte-free variety. If you are worried, if you don't know what kind of grass you have, or maybe it's an area that was mostly used for turf or planted in turf varieties, not forage varieties, OSU, Oregon State University, has an endophyte lab, and that will be included in our follow-up email. So you can send them a sample and they will test it for endophytes, which is really important to know. All right, moving on, we have trees and shrubs. And I will start here. Do not feed yard clippings to your horses. Don't prune, trim branches after doing yard work, and feed it to your animals, or maybe you just put it into a big pile that maybe you'll use as a burn pile, or you'll get to it eventually and it's sitting there and animals have access to it. Many ornamental plant varieties are toxic, and as a rule of thumb, just don't feed them. This is just a very short list here. It goes on and on. Rhododendron, oleander, milkweed. A lot of people plant those for pollinators. Apples and pears. Feeding fallen apples and pears can be dangerous. Many horses won't ever have issues with eating some apples, sure, but horses can develop colic from eating too many, and tossing several of them frequently into your horses isn't a good idea. It's not worth it. I just, in general, don't feed yard clippings, and that includes if you just have a pile that the animals have access to. There's nothing else to eat. They might go munch on it, or you just have that one goofball who decides he's bored and wants to try it out. Some of the common ones, red maple is very toxic. Wilted or dried leaves of the maple are toxic to horses. Some other species can be toxic, but red maple is the most common one. Most native species are not an issue. If you have a maple in or adjacent to your pasture, it's important to know what variety you have. The toxin in this plant destroys red blood cells, and signs can include breathing difficulties, jaundice, dark brown urine, and eventually death. Leaves are most dangerous when wilted. So for example, you have a big storm, you have a red maple tree right next to your pasture, some branches fall down in there. Even autumn leaves that have piled up in your pasture, autumn leaves can be toxic for up to 30 days. And so you really need to make sure if you have one of those, you know where it is. If it's getting into your pasture, it's important, and don't let red maple leaves pile up. Black walnut is another ornamental tree that is toxic to horses. It can be a problem if it's in or near around your pasture. Another thing, and a problem that happens often, is shavings and bedding. If your shavings or bedding or wood chips, anything that you use around your horses, if it has black walnut in there, any amount of shavings can be toxic to your horse. They can develop colic, edema, laminitis. It's really important to know where your shavings are from. Or say you got a really good deal on wood chips because a neighborhood had a bunch of fallen trees, chipped them all together, and you might want to use it as footing material in your stalls or anything like that. It's really important to know where you're getting your shavings, because again, it doesn't happen too often, but if there was black walnut in that neighborhood or it comes into contact with your horses, it is toxic. And that includes the bark, shavings, roots, and the nuts. So if you have it close by and the nuts are falling into your pasture, it's just a good thing to know. Okay, horse chestnut, again, another ornamental plant. If you have it next to your pasture, it's important to know. But as long as you're not feeding your ornamental clippings to your horses, you won't have too many issues here. Leaves, seeds, young shoots, they're all poisonous. And this affects gastrointestinal and central nervous systems of the animal. So most of the time, native plants aren't really as much of an issue compared to ornamentals. But in this case, Pacific yew, which is around here in the Pacific Northwest, is toxic. Most parts of the plant is toxic: foliage, bark, seeds, even these red berries. They're also toxic to humans. So there have been cases of children getting those berries and eating them and getting sick. These also have the alkaloid toxin. Again, as long as you're just aware and you don't feed the clippings, shouldn't be too big of an issue. And last in our tree and shrub category is prunus species. So I have an example of chokecherry up there. There are lots of species in this family: chokecherry, black cherry, plums, peaches, apricots, apples. They can all cause issues. So good to be aware of them. Leaves, twigs, bark, seeds are all highly toxic. This plant produces cyanide, and poisonings with the prunus species can progress rapidly. Okay. Another important category is injurious plants. And we've talked about toxicities, poisonous plants, but ones that can do a lot of harm are injurious plants. And for this class, these are mostly going to be weedy grass species, like annual grasses that have sharp awns. And these awns can injure eyes, mouth, noses, ears. Even if you have other livestock and pets, they can also get injuries from these. I swear my dog has built-in magnets for all of his paws to attract awns. Even though I checked them all, I've had vet bills due to these awns. So it's important to manage them. Some of these are very hard to tell apart. I recommend bringing samples in if you really need to identify them. But luckily, a lot of the management is the same for these. If you have a really serious problem, you won't be able to do too much without spraying. I mean, there are some methods. It's going to take some time and some real management. But a lot of times you have to spray a non-selective herbicide and start from scratch, unfortunately. Some other suggested treatment regimen for treating many of these includes, that classic soil testing and fertilizing. So you are encouraging the grasses you want to grow there. Herbicide treatments, working the ground, tilling, reseeding your desirable species, and then again, sticking with proper grazing management and monitoring. Ripgut brome is one we have here and can be very injurious. Grows 1 to 3 feet tall, has hairy sheaths, drooping spikelets, and it has really long, stiff awns. These awns aren't as what I call fluffy as some of the other ones you'll see. And this is an annual grass. Downy brome, this one's commonly called cheatgrass, although a lot of these with pokey awns kind of get lumped into the cheatgrass family sometimes. This one can be 4 to 30 inches tall. And it can start off as bright green. Sometimes it changes to purple and then to tan as it matures. It is another annual grass. Medusa head looks a little bit different here, as open sheaths with long hairy collars, kind of some shorter barbs at the base of the awns, and is an annual. This one has kind of this distinctive awn shape. Again, you have some shorter ones here at the base. Grasses are really hard to identify. Melissa and Cheyenne might disagree with me. I have a hard time with grasses. They're notoriously hard. And so I wouldn't get too caught up on finding the exact species on your own. You can talk to your extension office, your SWCDs, but most weedy annual species can be managed the same, like I said. Next up is foxtail barley, also called squirrel tail barley. It's pale green, bushy, nodding spikes. Its awns are 1 to 2.5 inches long. This one and some others can be palatable and non-injurious at really early stages, but just good to manage. You still don't want them, but they can be kind of grazed at early stages. This one is a perennial. Hair barley, frequently called wild barley, is a winter annual grass. The mature plant can grow up to 3 feet tall, has many branched stems, and is an annual. And again, don't have to get caught up on memorizing what these look like too much here. Mediterranean barley, a member of the barley family. This one is related to cereal barley. It's 10 to 40 centimeters tall, so it's quite a bit shorter than some of the other ones we've seen. Lower blades, sheaths are usually hairy, and it is an annual. And I'll be testing you on all these annual grass species, so I hope you're ready. Next up, so this one, I put it in the injurious category. I wouldn't really call it injurious, as more of a real pain in the neck, pain in the butt weed here. It's not to be confused with fiddleneck, because fiddleneck is often called tarweed, but coast tarweed is super sticky. All parts of the plant have this sticky substance, and one resource I read called it disagreeably scented, which was a really nice way to say it doesn't smell great. And the sticky resin will stick all over your animals, stick on your horses, and then that just collects dirt and dust. And if you're working out in it, it's just a pain. To control them, you can mow the plants when stalks are actively growing, as long as you do it before they're flowering. That will help reduce some additional seed production. But really, again, hand pulling, digging small infestations, and then using herbicides, that 2,4-D, listed for broadleaf weeds, can be effective. And again, applying when it's in the rosette stage is most effective for this plant. All right, I only have one of these questions for you. We have our next poll. And this one's tougher, so I understand. But if you give your best guess for what this plant is. All right, I think we have most of our answers in. So this one is Medusa head barley. It was a little tougher. Mediterranean barley. Let's see if I go back here. Doesn't have quite as fluffy of a on head there. Let's see if I can get back to Medusa head. Medusa head has these kind of shorter barbs towards the base. Again, these are hard. I just threw this one in here. Don't expect you to be able to identify each annual weedy species, but we know it's not tarweed, right? It looks very different. And tarweed is a forb, and this is an annual grass. So thank you for participating. All right, now we'll talk about timing and weed management. So right now it is spring, early summer, and now is the time to manage your weeds. Many of these weeds haven't bolted or flowered yet, gone to seeds. They're still a manageable size. Also, you can hit it when the ground is wet or moist. If you have a small infestation, you would prefer to use mechanical methods. And then if you would like to use chemical, you can spray when they're actively growing, they haven't bolted yet, and they're still in the rosette stage for forbs. Now, summer is not the best time. I always feel heartbroken when people call me, late summer, and they say, I've got these huge, tall weeds with yellow flowers. I think it might be tansy, because there's just not as much you can do in the late summer period. Plants are big, herbicides are going to be less effective. The ground is dry. It's going to be harder to dig up. It's just not the time to manage. Now, it's not saying don't do anything to your weeds. If they haven't gone to seed, you can try to mow some, but again, mowing isn't recommended for all. So we recommend contacting, your extension specialist, SWCD, for help there. Fall can also be a good time to manage weeds. Some of them will go into that rosette stage again. They're working on root development, so it can be a good time to manage them. And then also if you hit it when the ground is moist, it can be easier to dig up. In winter, keep your horses off of wet pastures. If you take one thing away, well, you should take several things away, I hope, from the presentation today. But when you have animals on wet pastures, creating compaction, bare soil, you're going to have more weeds. And just in general, some year-round management tips. Be aware of the toxic plants on your property. Follow best management practices like using heavy use areas, not overgrazing, taking care of your grass stands, and also following those strategies to minimize your risk, like feeding your animals before putting them out to pasture, supplementing feed if forage availability is low, and all the things that we've talked about in previous sessions with Cheyenne and Melissa. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. I just have a few more polls here. Gauge some learning, keep you engaged here. What leads to weeds, including dangerous ones? All right, I gave you guys an easy one after that annual grass question. So all of these should be pretty darn good. Not maintaining your pasture health, overgrazing, compaction, not using sacrifice over winter areas, and then poor timing and weed management. All right. Thank you. And the next one here. What practices can minimize the risk of poisoning? And thank you to Melissa for being my poll launcher. Now I have a lot of questions here, so I appreciate it. Man, you guys are really using your critical reading skills today. I thought I'd trip somebody up by throwing in some trick answers in there. So you're all correct. Some things that can help minimize the risk of poisoning are feeding before letting your animals out to pasture, especially if they've been in dry lot areas, walking your pasture, getting familiar with weeds, supplementing the diet if forage is low, and not feeding ornamental clippings or asking them nicely not to eat poisonous weeds. As much as I wish that would work, it has not. Okay, and my last poll of the evening, you guys will be rid of polls, is generally when is the best time to manage weeds? Awesome. Spring is usually the best time. You can also do it in the fall, but if you do it in the fall, I just definitely recommend going out again in the spring and getting any of that regrowth out there and again. So thank you for that. Perfect. All right, now for resources. I have some great resources for you. Again, I have that split position where I work for OSU Extension small farms and for a soil and water conservation district. So I might be biased, but I think they're pretty darn great about having resources for you in terms of managing dangerous weeds and just weeds in general. So OSU Extension, we have a whole extension catalog. We've got resources, technical advice that we can offer, classes, and we can help with plant ID if you send us clear pictures or bring in a sample. And remember, if you think it's something poisonous that's toxic to humans, like poison hemlock, Ziploc baggie would be great, and not just dumping it off to somebody who might not know it's toxic. It's just good to know that. And I am going to show you where you can grab some of these. So can you see the OSU Extension catalog on your screen? Awesome. Okay. So the OSU Extension catalog, we have this great catalog with several topics, but also includes weeds. If there's a problem weed you're looking for, or just in general, you can use the search bar here under search catalog. We also, I think it might be a little bit easier to go to let's go back up, our Small Farms Program website. And if you scroll down to the resources for farmers section, we have options like livestock where you can click on that. There's a horse section. We have several helpful fact sheets and articles there. But if you click on pastures and hay, we have a whole section on weeds, poisonous plants, and other pests. So a whole bunch of resources that you can see. And again, I will share links to all of these that I talk about and more with you in a follow-up email. So some great resources here. Now, next is soil and water conservation districts. I happen to work for the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District, but there are conservation districts all over Oregon and in other states too, and they are a great resource. You can also get technical advice, plant ID, and they also can offer classes depending on the district and what they do. Here on ours, if you do stay informed, you go to resources, agriculture, and then we have resources, agriculture, invasive species. That's what I wanted. Sorry about that. Invasive species. They have a ton of guides, and I know the Marion SWCD, if you're in Marion County, has resources as well. Most of them will have a lot to help you with if you just give them a call. Another one I'll talk about later is the Oregon Invasives Hotline. It just happens to be on this website here. But if you think you have something extremely invasive and it needs to be a list of invasive, like water hemlock, you can call the Oregon Invasive Plant Hotline, and they can help you with IDs and tips for removal as well. All right, and another one I referenced was the Pacific Northwest Weed Management Handbook. This is great if you are interested in using herbicide and you want to know what is labeled for certain weeds or rates and timings. As an example, we could go down here, and it can be a little bit finicky in terms of how you word the weed. But like, for example, if I just type in tansy, okay, it did come up. Sometimes if you do part of the word, it won't do it. But if you go by ragwort, it will come up. And just an example here, apply, it gives you the chemicals that are labeled for or can be used with tansy ragwort, rates, timing, other safety tips. And again, always important to read the label. If you have any questions at all, contact an expert and they can help you. It's very important to apply chemicals exactly as labeled. All right, and just a few others. Oregon Flora is a great website. It has a ton of pictures. It's a plant database where you can look up several different weeds. Cornell University, their ag animal science program, I believe, has a poisonous plants database, and that's for plants all over the US, not just in Western Oregon. And the Oregon Invasive Species Hotline, which I mentioned, is also can be important if you'd like to use them. And then with that, I will share my contact information. If you have further questions, contact me, especially if you're in Marion Polk counties. If you have a farm or think about starting a farm there, I'm always happy to talk to farmers, new farmers. And my email is there as well, and will be sent in the follow-up question or follow-up email. And with that, I will take questions, and thank you so much for bearing with me today. I know it's a lot of plants to throw out at one time, but I appreciate it.